Hey everyone, good morning or good afternoon. We've got John Rustad with us today. Lots of stuff going on in the news today this week. John, how you been?
Well, it's been a good summer up here in the middle of the province in the Chaco Lakes. So you go a little bit further south, though, it hasn't been so good. The wildfires have been, pretty horrendous, impacting a lot of people.
No, it's been terrible. It's been terrible. There's a couple things I wanted to bring you on. For one, you have a lot of experience in forestry, especially where you're from. Um, First things off, I'd like to talk about the forest management in Summerland and in the interior. It seems like the forest fires are getting worse, but what I'm hearing is there's a lot less controlled fires as there were before. How much does this have to do with poor forestry management, considering that we've had a flag of pine beetles, the last 10 years, and we've known about this for quite a while? How much of this falls on poor forestry management?
I would say a good portion. I don't know what sort of percentage, but certainly more than half of the problem. And so I'll take a step back and just sort of walk you through decisions that have led to the circumstances we have today. Back in the 70s, it was always the next valley was available. People didn't really think too much about broader forest management. In the 80s, similar type of a situation. Started thinking a little bit more about things. Once we got into the 90s, by mid 90s, we ended up in the situation where the pine beetle epidemic became more than just something that could be managed with a few spot, tree removals and burns. And there was a decision at the time to not focus the harvesting on the pine trees, but to carry on with a broader, broader profile of trees that were to be cut. By the time we got to the late 90s, it became very obvious that this was not going away. We weren't going to have a cold winter to deal with it, and it was going to get worse. And the ministry itself at the time actually wanted to do a great big burn in Tweedsmuir Park, which was the source of a lot of this problems because companies weren't allowed to go in and deal with it. And so the ministry had a perfect conditions, they had a nice stable high, it was going to be a big fire. And the politicians of the day stepped in and said, no, we don't want that big a fire, wait till it cools down a little bit and then burn. So they did, they waited till the fall, and of course the burn was ineffective and the rest is history. The pine beetle, of course, wiped out the area. Now, here's where this compounds with forest management decisions. Because we had not managed for the potential for large-scale fires, we didn't create natural fire breaks, we stopped doing things like broadcast burning of existing cut blocks. Fuel loads were allowed to build. We didn't use fire as a management tool to the extent that was needed on the landscape. And so the fuel loads were allowed to build. The dry conditions left us in a very vulnerable situation. And now when you have a fire, and if it gets a chance to take off, you're going to have a big fire. And so that's what has led to it. And so it was a series of bad decisions that, you can state all the way back to kind of the 60s and 70s, compounded a little bit in the 80s, but then was really compounded by bad decisions in the 90s when the NDP were in power. And even when you got into the pine beetle, we did do all of the focusing. We had the majority of our harvesting focused in the pine affected areas. But at that point, it was a little too late, right? Because we couldn't go in and get it all. The fuel loads were still allowed to continue to build. So it's a compounding problem. And then I would argue our firefighting methodologies are still archaic. They have not kept up with modern technology, modern times in terms of how fires could actually be fought. So there's a lot of bad decisions that were made through multiple layers of governments, and the current government's policy, particularly around not being able to go into what they call old growth stands, which is what we call just normal stands in the interior, has made it almost impossible to get in and actually do proper forest management today.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I've done a little bit of research, and it seems like a lot of these trees, and especially these areas, they've like the evolutionary of some of these trees. They're And what I mean by that is that like their pine cones, like they develop like a fire retardant resin, and they fall into the the aftermath of like these devastated areas. It's part of like their evolution, from what I can see,
That,
and it almost
that's
seems like it's part of the ecosystem,
All
and
right.
that the fact that we're preventing like this ecosystem from facilitating itself, it just seems like we're perpetuating the problem, kicking the can down the road. And I think what we're seeing in Summerland is probably a perfect example of that. I think Jasper, they were warning of that,
yeah.
Jasper, they were warning of that like years before that, and when we saw what happened there in Banff. Let
Yeah,
me
but
ask you a question. Like,
but
what prevents? Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say you're absolutely right. I mean, pine cones are designed to open at I think like 3,000 degrees, and so they can survive very hot fires. And the tree has developed in an area that historically has been dominated by wildfires. And I did a wildfire study back in the 90s, everything from 100 Mile House all the way up to north of Prince George, from Smithers all the way out to McBride, and mapped wildfire disturbances over a 160-year period. And you could see how these fires happened, large and small, over these periods of time. And it's no wonder that's where you have the majority of the pine trees that were growing, because they grew up with a natural ability. They were able to survive these wildfires, and they're designed for it. Fire is a natural occurrence on the landscape. Similar with Douglas fir. The Douglas fir develop very thick bark, which can survive fires going through, small fires going through, because it will scorch the outside layer, but the tree remains intact and survivable. And so fire is a natural occurrence on the landscape. What isn't natural is back in the late 40s, early 50s, we actually became pretty good at putting out fires. And so we stopped there being large-scale fires for many decades and allowed the trees to get far older than they would normally be in those landscapes, which, of course, led to much higher fuel loads and the disastrous fire situations we're seeing today.
It seems like BC doesn't have a standing water bomber, fleet. It seems like from my research, it's all leased, and we lease most of our fleet from other provinces, other third-party companies. What do you have to say? Like, what are your thoughts on, having a standing fleet? And does that have to be federally? Do the feds have to get involved for us to, get to that level where we have like 13 water bombers like on standby?
Well, this becomes the problem when you look at how our fires are managed. And there's a lot of problems. Everything from the ministry won't allow private sector to get in and fight a fire until they've done assessments. It takes them forever to do assessments. Fires get to take off. There's a whole bunch of issues that are there, but delivery of water is one of the critical issues, obviously. And they've invested in what's called a bunch of Bushmaster, which are the small water bomber type planes. They can be very effective with small fires, and in terms of they're very agile and very capable, very mobile. But we don't have any real large scale water delivery systems. Very few in any case, and we do hire them, or we contract them in to come in. But how we fight these fires, I think, is more of an issue as opposed to the equipment. Yes, we do need to make sure we have the equipment, but we're still using the same pump technology and stuff that we were using in the 1950s. We aren't looking at and rarely deploy mass water delivery systems. The ministry was even reluctant to use structural protection units until they were proven out in 2003 with the big fires that we had back then in Kelowna. And so it's very reluctant to use new technology and changes. We often do a lot of our firefighting in the middle of the day. For example, we send out helicopters and other technology to assess the situation. It comes back in, you develop a plan, then at 10 o'clock you send out your crews. Well, the best time for fighting a fire is 6 in the morning. You want to be pulling your crews off at noon because there's not much they can do except for, the stuff along the sides of a fire. But we don't do that. It's even better if you can have crews at night, but of course that's far more dangerous, getting out at nighttime fighting. But early in the morning is when we should be sending out our crews, but the ministry doesn't do that in their approach. And so, yes, bombers,
Right.
the equipment that we have, the delivery of water, all needs to be looked at in terms of it. But the general process that we use for firefighting, there was 2 years ago, I think it was, maybe 3 years ago now, there was 120 guys or people, not all men, not all guys, 122 firefighters that were going to go in to fight on a fire. And they sat at the road for between 4 and 5 hours waiting to go in because somebody had to deliver a porta potty that had washing facilities because the crew was too large. Like, I'm sorry, that's kind of crazy, So, but this is the types of things that we do now in the province in firefighting. We get heavy duty equipment that could go in and put a guard around a fire, but they're not allowed to do it until the ministry's done the assessment and come up with a strategy. And so we're very it just doesn't happen quickly in terms of how things are done. There was a fire a number of years ago. One of the logging companies, one of the forest companies had crews in the area, experienced firefighters, and they weren't allowed to go in for 7 days. In the meantime, this fire then took off, and finally a ministry person came in and developed a plan and then allowed these guys to go in. They could have got in on day 1, day 2, and had this thing put out. Instead, it became a massive fire. And this is the inability of the ministry to actually fight fires appropriately in this province.
Do you think that that's incompetence, or do you think that it's? I feel like in 2020, I hate to say that, is it incompetence? I feel like that from 2020 to 2026, government has been nothing but incompetent. Is it a lack of accountability?
So
is that what the problem is we're seeing in from government?
Yeah, see, the problem is that we, and at various levels of government, but it's become very much more prominent now with the NDP in power. Everything is what you would call cover your ass. Sorry for using that language, but I mean, that's what it's called.
Swear.
And so it's all about the process. As long as the process is being followed, nobody is held accountable. Because it's the process that's probably got to fix the process. And so everything is so process driven now that it actually inhibits our ability to actually take the logical or common sense action that really should be taken. Because if somebody does that and something goes wrong, however remote it might be, now somebody's ass is in a sling. And so everybody's afraid to take any kind of action. And so they develop these processes, which take forever and make us extremely slow and ineffective in being able to fight, significant fires. Now, having said that, our initial attack crews are actually quite good at getting into the little spot fires and taking things out, but they can't get to them all. And that's where you run into these problems.
Right. And like you say, it's processes. Is the problem I like the idea that you're saying it's processes, but I almost feel like it's just human nature that, when I think large groups of people get together, they default to incompetence, and I think that government is especially true.
Dan, let me ask you this question. So if you had a choice, you're working in a job with a company or you had a choice to take your own initiative and potentially lose your job or even get fined, lose your livelihood, or to follow the rules, which would you do? And you would
I absolutely agree, and I think that's
following the rules. And if something goes wrong, you're protected because you followed the rules. And that's where we run into the problem.
Is that why the NDP is so allergic to having their outcomes published for specific departments and initiatives? Because it almost seems like this government doesn't want any transparency, and in fact, they're fighting transparency at every corner. Do you think that that's part of the problem, is that they don't want to see these outcomes? Because you can argue processes, yeah, sure, but I would almost say that if I would prefer to have a government that has, say that we tried, we failed, we're going to be trying something new, rather than we're going to continue on failure. And I think that that's the problem that we fell with Safe Supply, is that we had a government that didn't want to measure outcomes. And it came down to people saying that our children are getting addicted. It's our children that are getting harmed because of these outcomes. And we had a government that was unwilling to suggest that this was a problem. And we fast forward to 2026, and we can say that it is a failure. But is the problem that these processes is we don't have enough public accounting, that we're not we're not divulging enough information to the public. Is that what you think would be? Is that something that you'd think that is a
Well,
problem here, or is it something
I
else?
think there's two parts to that answer. The politicians, they want to cover their ass. They don't want public scrutiny. They want to be able to move forward and spin. This is great. We're doing great work. Look over here. Here's the example of how we're doing things that are working. So that is one problem. But it's a problem of all governments. But it's especially true with the NDP. I mean, the media have called them the most secretive government in Canadian history. However, the bureaucracy is also part of the problem, because as much as they want to, and I believe they're good people, they want to do the right thing, they also don't want to take the heat, and which is why they try to really push and drive process. And so if you've got a government that is relatively incompetent, ministers that really don't know their files, and you've got a bureaucracy that is trying to protect themselves, then you've got the bureaucracy saying to the government, we need to do things this way, and the government saying, okay, that makes sense, we'll do it that way. So the bureaucracy ends up driving these processes to cover their backside, and when something goes wrong, the politicians are being secretive, and nothing gets changed.
Right. So do you think that that's why like the government right now is hiding like the details for like these treaty announcements? Do you think that they're the reason is they don't want to open up the books for these treaties? Like, I mean, right now, Bob Macklin, he flagged, 135,000 hectares being transferred to First Nations without any public consultation. Do you think the reason that the government or the NDP don't want to consult with the public is because they understand the public backlash and they'd rather just force feed these treaties down our throats?
Yes.
And because they're afraid of the public backlash? Or what are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. They don't want it to be public because they know that there will be backlash. But they also have a different philosophy in that it's government to government negotiations. And there's no role for the public. There's no role for the average person in British Columbia to be involved. Their perspective, this government's perspective, is to inform them. And if something goes wrong, they've got to do a better job of informing the public of the decision that was made. And if they have to pause because there's too much backlash, they will. But they will still carry on and actually do the agreement once the backlash dies down. They've proven them that's what they've done in the past, and public's attention can be relatively short on issues, and so they get a bunch of backlash, so they back off and they do a bunch of shuffle and smoke and mirrors, and next thing you know, they've just implemented it. And so that's that they believe strongly that the role of government, this NDP government, is to negotiate with the First Nations government and do deals there, and the public and the broader community has no place in that agreement except to be informed once the agreement is completed.
And that's kind of what we saw with Cowichan, is that they decided they were going to abandon the field. They weren't going to appeal the ruling until obviously the public backlash was so great that they had no choice.
They made a very important decision not to inform the landowners and not to allow them to participate in the court case. So that's why it came out as such a surprise. They, by every right, they should have had the ability to hire lawyers collectively or individually and be part of the court case. And the government made a decision not to do that. They made an intentional decision to keep the public in the dark.
With this 135,000 hectare land deal, have you seen any maps for the Kitsu-Callum deal? Have you or any of your colleagues seen any maps? Has the government procured any? Because I believe my colleagues over in Sika Media, they looked at it and they saw no maps publicly available. Have you or anyone else in the Conservative Party of BC been able to find any?
So with Kitsilus and Kitsim-Callum, both of those are treaty nations. Their treaties are pending to come forward this fall. Kitsilus was introduced in last spring as a treaty. Kitsim-Callum is yet to be introduced, and it will be. And so I was actually involved in the agreement in principle, which did identify some lands as part of treaty. way back when I was minister responsible for Aboriginal relations and reconciliation. So I don't know how things have changed, but my guess is things have changed a fair bit since then in terms of these treaties. But I guess we'll find out this fall when we get a chance to debate them in the legislature.
Right.
Sorry.
You a lot of people right now in British Columbia, I think that there's a misconception of treaty and versus Section 35 and what the NDP was doing versus what you were doing with the past government with the Liberals. Do you mind detailing that a little bit for me and kind of like paint the nuance of what was different between, you know, the Liberal Party before DRIPA came in power and what they're dealing with now? Because it almost seems like the government is saying that DRIPA and UNDRIP, or we can't do any deals without them. And to me, that seems very disingenuous because this UNDRIP and DRIPA are very new, and yet we were able to get treaties before this, especially in other provinces. Why is this so important for the NDP, and why is it a myth that UNDRIP and DRIPA need to be in place?
So that's interesting because, I mean, when I was minister, I signed 435 agreements with First Nations. Most people don't even know about them because there were never any issues, because we made sure we took care of the public interest as part of what we needed to do. There was some things that were contentious that needed to be dealt with when it came to treaties. But that was how we did things. And now there's been, you know, a handful, dozen, whatever it is, agreements that this government has done, and they've said they had to do DRIPA and UNDRIP to do it. Well, no, they didn't. We did all these agreements beforehand. Same type of agreements they're doing now. So what's changed? And what's changed is ideology. And that's and they've taken this thing down the road now where the expectations and the ability to actually be able to resolve these issues under Section 35 of the Constitution is almost impossible now because of where this government has gone and what they've created with UNDRIP, implemented through DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So we have the world has changed a lot. But you don't need any of those things to get done. Section 35 of the Constitution, which protects Aboriginal rights, is very well defined now by court cases in terms of what needs to be done for consultation and accommodation where required.
Right. I don't mean to pivot. I apologize because I was looking at some of your tweets just now, and one thing kind of struck me as I was scrolling was Western Standard kind of flagged that the government's communication during the Summerland fires, and I hate to pivot back to this but it is important. They say the communication, they almost seem like they don't want to communicate on all avenues. On X, they're picking certain avenues, and the information is coming out. It's not as easily accessible as this government's making it as it should be. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just that they're just not prepared, that there's no, like, I would assume by now in 2026 we would have processes that would determine, hey, like, we need to have communications available, like hourly communications on X, Meta, and YouTube, like hourly. Is that not a thing, or is this government just with their pants down? Like they just don't understand how to deal with any kind of emergency, or is it just or are they defaulting back to you need a phone, you need to look at this website? Like, do you think that this government is doing a good enough job to communicate with the public about the emergency? And then my second question on top of that is, do you think that they declared a state of emergency fast enough? Because I know that your colleagues at the caucus put out a press release the other day saying that that this government needs to go into a state of emergency. Do you think that they did it fast enough, and do you think that they're communicating properly with the general public?
So I'll take the second part first, and say that it was almost 2 weeks ago now when I did an interview with CBC as well as with some of the other reporters, saying that we needed to have a state of emergency declared in BC, and gave the reasons why. As a former forest minister, I know the conditions, I know what was needed. We were in a situation where we needed to be able to pull any resources that we could to try to prevent the disaster that is currently happening. So I called for it then. The minister said, no, we don't need one. Well, here we are. Obviously, they've declared one because they do need one. And this is the problem with both the bureaucracy, but with this government in particular, is they try hard not to create a fuss over something until they absolutely have to. They want to just say, everything's okay, nothing to worry about here kind of thing. That's their approach. Now, when it comes to communications, this is where things get a little bit confusing, because the actual communication responsibility to the public is actually the regional district's responsibility and the municipality's responsibility, and government gives them the information to communicate. And so there's a little bit of confusion there, but I actually think government needs to take a far greater role in that communications, making sure the public is made aware of what was happening. And so when I was Minister of Forest, I used to go on, for example, Global every morning and give an update in terms of what was happening with forests, what was happening with our fires in the day. And that was just an approach that I took, because I felt communication was very important, so people knew what was going on and what government was doing to try to alleviate the problems.
Yeah, leaders lead, and I respect that, and I think that a lot of people are really hungry for that. I think that when you see Mark Carney going to Italy, and then David Eby when he was up north doing like a ribbon cutting, I think people were kind of expecting them to kind of drop what they were doing and see what the devastation was like. But that's neither here nor there. I'd like to pivot a little bit, John, to a tweet that you made on July 28th. And so you said, Eby has put critical minerals on the table against leverage against U.S. tariffs. The Mining Association of BC has warned that restricting these exports would likely produce severe escalation of trade war. Tex Trail operations depends on ore shipments from Red Dog Mine in Alaska. Germanium from that process supports American defense and technology supply chains. Last year, BC sent $2 billion in metallic minerals south, mostly aluminum and zinc. Meanwhile, the United States has already set 50% tariffs on $20 billion in Canadian exports to begin August 19th, including plywood and other wood products. The mining jobs and processing plants and rural communities built around them are the ones that will absorb whatever follows. I'd love to hear a little bit more what your thoughts on that, John.
Well, it's complex to begin with, obviously, in terms of trade with the United States. And when you've got somebody like Donald Trump south of the border, it gets even more complex, because he's very erratic, and he's a bully, and lies and on threats. And if you want to know how Donald Trump thinks in terms of doing negotiations, read the book The Art of the Deal, because clearly he lays it out in terms of how he does things, and so it's pretty obvious you know what to expect from Donald Trump. The problem now with putting things like critical minerals on the list is twofold. First of all, you're going to get a serious reaction, because the Americans are going to be, you want to play tough? Here, we'll play tough. Maybe we'll just stop shipping diesel. Maybe we'll just stop shipping, jet fuel. Maybe we'll stop selling you power. Like, there's lots of things Americans can do to make it really difficult for British Columbians, and we need them far more than they need us. And so you got to think about how you want to manage through those issues. But the second piece of that is, if you're a company that's looking to build a mine in British Columbia, and you're talking about putting $1 billion, $2 billion, $5 billion into the ground and expecting a return on that capital, if you don't know suddenly whether or not you're going to be able to sell your products, or whether or not there's going to be some other barriers or issues, I can tell you, you're not going to put that money in the ground. You're going to hold off. You're going to wait. And so all it does is create a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and has the potential to generate a huge amount of backlash from our largest trading partner and our most important trading partner. And just as a side note, this is the thing that really gets me the most. Under the NDP, we've actually increased our trade with the Americans by 23%, while we decreased our trade with our Asian partners. So go figure. They become more reliant on having to trade with the Americans and less with other jurisdictions over their tenure. And now they're screaming, oh, we've got to figure out how to diversify. All we had to do is go back to the policies that were in place before the NDP took power. And we were on that path already for diversification.
Right. Let me ask you a question. I mean, you can say what you will about Donald Trump and his stance on trade, but you can argue with some of the results. I mean, you made a tweet on the 29th talking about Interfor moving their corporate support operations from Burnaby to Georgia. That's a major blow to the BC executive sector. What are your thoughts on the NDP policy of making it hard to? This goes back to the Summerland fire forestry management, but What are your thoughts on how this government has dealt with wood and forestry in general? Obviously, they've been thinking it's a sunset industry, as Carolyn Finley, your leader, has said, but this has been going on a long time, and now it seems like they're surprised that this is going on. I'd love to hear what your thoughts on that are.
Look, it's really simple when you think about it. If you're hostile to an industry, if you're the highest cost producers, boards make decisions to do things to get into a lower cost jurisdiction and get into a jurisdiction that actually, welcomes it. And that's what you're seeing. We've got a government that is hostile to forestry. They've created the highest cost jurisdiction by a long measure. In British Columbia, people are struggling to do business. Most people are saying, geez, if I go south of the border, I'm going to add 10, 20, 30% rate onto my bottom line. Why am I not doing this? So, but however, the hostility goes much further than just forestry. Look at Nutrient's decision to ship potash through Washington State. They're investing billions of dollars building a new port facility in Washington State to be able to export their products instead of going to British Columbia. We had the capacity to be able to do it through the Port of Prince Rupert. We had the room for expansion to have that investment in British Columbia, but they moved down there because of two reasons. One, it was take forever to get permits through here, and two, we were a hostile environment. So they thought, you know what, we don't want to wait that time. We can't afford that uncertainty. We need to be able to go forward and make those investments. And so British Columbia lost out on a huge opportunity for port expansion and the work that would come from doing that. Not to mention the goodwill of continually building that relationship between British Columbia and governments like Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Right, and that kind of comes back to this government picking. It seems like they're just abandoning the northern BC. Nutrien could have gone not only through Prince George, but it could have gone through even the southern ports. I'm sure that there would have been a lot of welcomed expansion and economic activity here in Vancouver ports and the North Shore ports, even the Surrey ports. I'm sure that they would have welcomed that. And it almost seems like a lost opportunity. $1 billion for the project, but that doesn't even include like the continued sustained jobs that those kind of that infrastructure maintains. But also, you've been very outspoken about a northern route for the pipeline. I think a lot of people see that as a kind of a moot point. However, having said that, I know a lot of northern communities would really benefit from from having a pipeline. And I think I've heard in one of your interviews where you spoke about diesel having, if you had a pipeline to the north, you could put a diesel or a fuel refinery near that pipeline, and there would be a lot more economic activity for these northern communities that have been devastated by all of these forestry closures. Can I hear what your what your thoughts on there? And I'd love to hear what you were thinking when you were talking about that.
British Columbia refines about 35% of the product we consume. We get a bunch of our product from Alberta. We get a bunch from the United States. When it comes to diesel, we get probably the majority of our product from Alberta, but we get about 15-20% of diesel from the United States. Diesel, of course, is a byproduct that is produced in the refining process. Canada's oil is what's called heavy oil, which means it has the chemical components in it for being able to produce diesel. But we need more refining capacity. British Columbia is incredibly vulnerable. If Alberta separates or something goes on, are we going to continue to be the priority for Alberta to ship fuel? When you're talking down in the United States, diesel is now fetching in places like California $7 a gallon. In British Columbia, diesel's 25% more expensive than gasoline. And diesel is the driver of our economy. It's the trucks that deliver all of our food. It's the trains. It is so much in our transportation network that is critical. It is the forestry trucks. It is the farming vehicles. It's all of this that runs on diesel. And so we are vulnerable. And so we need another refinery. Now, the chances of building a refinery in the Lower Mainland are next to zero. It's crowded. The opposition would be pretty significant. But we could put a new refinery in a place like Kamloops, or we could put a refinery up in a place like Terrace, which I think would be a good location, and put in a new pipeline. We have to get over the fact that hydrocarbons are going to be used for many, many decades to come. We've spent $15 trillion as a world on wind and solar, the so-called renewables, which I would suggest are not really renewables, but we spent like $15 trillion, and that represents about 3% of the total world's energy. 15 trillion for 3%. The chances of us replacing oil and natural gas are zero anytime soon. It's going to take many, many decades. So why would we leave ourselves as a province vulnerable? We need to build out additional refining capacity. And in addition to that, we have more oil and gas than we could ever possibly use. Why aren't we exporting them, getting the revenue from that, helping to pay for health care, the solving drug issues and crime and things like that by generating those revenues? And a pipeline to the North Coast is the most effective, most cost-efficient, would generate the most revenue for us as a province and as a country. And so it just makes sense to do these things. And they can be done. For example, there's a company that I've been doing a little bit of work with that is looking at a northern route. That would be north of the Fraser, north of the Skeena. It would be outside of any of the major salmon runs. It would be a project that I think makes just a tremendous amount of sense. Put in a spur line down to Terrace, put in a refinery, get those products we need produced in BC, become self-sufficient, actually have government supporting the actual people who live in this province as opposed to just supporting their own ideologies.
Oh, great, John. No, I think that's a great idea. Well, I guess we're not going to see that with David Eby, considering he thinks that there's no private component or a private sector component that wants to endorse that. I hate to ask you, but there's some things going on in the background in terms of the BC Conservatives and polling. Right now, you guys, I've seen a recent poll where you guys are. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think that like do you hold that much stock in those polls? Do you think that since the BC leadership has come, and it almost seems like you guys should be ahead. You guys should be kind of sailing from the honeymoon into to August 11th, and it really surprises me to see you down several points. Do you put much stock into that, and if so, why?
So, polling is polling. We'll see. I'm very tempted to say no comment. However, that's usually not my style, although I do like to use that line from time to time, as you well know.
Yeah.
But look, we have a challenge as the Conservative Party, and I think as Carrie Lynn Finlay, and that is people need to get to know who she is and what she's about. And so we need to make sure, do what we can to get her out there, get people to see, what it is that we stand for, what a conservative government would look like. And so I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think the polls reflect that people in this province are uncertain about what that is. And there's still some bad blood with the leadership race and divisive and all kinds of issues. And that's normal in a leadership race. So the question will become in the coming months is, are we going to be able to help define just what it is that our new leader wants to be doing as this province, and giving people an opportunity to be able to see that clearly as opposed to just more of the rhetoric that is out there today.
I've seen a tweet with Dallas Brody and Yuri Fulmer and your leader, and there's kind of rumors that she might be welcomed back into caucus. What are your thoughts on, would she be welcomed back into caucus? Is everyone going to be kumbaya if she gets brought back in?
Well, you're asking the wrong person about that. I have been talking with Dallas because I actually think it's important that we resolve the issue that caused the split back in spring of 2025. And so I've been talking to her about how to do that. I'm hopeful that we will be able to find a way to be able to do that. As to whether or not she ever comes back in as part of caucus, that's not something that I can really comment on. So I'd probably better not to make any speculation on that.
Well, fair enough. I think that at the end of the day, I think that Dallas Brody and even Taryn Armstrong represent a specific space within BC Conservatives and BC as a province. I think that they reach people that feel like they haven't been, or that the government has baby abandoned and they don't speak to, even the BC Conservative Party to some extent. And I think it's very important to maybe not embrace all of their ideas, but I definitely think that it's worth listening to. I think that, we need to listen a little bit more and understand why people are so angry. I think that right now the BC, not even BC conservatives, but federal conservatives are kind of reckoning why people are so angry and why their base is so angry, and they think that, well, maybe it's because of our leader, and these people are just bad apples. But I also think that it's very disingenuous to ignore what those people are feeling. I think that especially in this province, I think that it's expensive to live. You can't afford to have a family, especially if you live in the urban centers, and I think that to have this idea that we need to bail out condos and keep prices inflated, and that we can't. What does it look like if condo prices drop? Like, what does that look like? Is that gonna bankrupt our entire province? Well, maybe we should be having that conversation, because right now a lot of people got rich when the prices went up. And a consequence of that is that people can't afford to have families here. It's too expensive. They're priced out. And if we can't have families, then we're essentially, what do we do? And it's not just our province, it's Canada, not just our country, but everyone is dealing with shrinkflation. And I think that as a society, we need to kind of reconcile what that means and what it means to have a family. And I think it's important, because I don't think that we can be sustained as a country, especially with us continuing to borrow at the levels we're borrowing, if we don't sustain our population.
You've touched on a number of things there, and
I know it was a little bit of a tangent. I'm
well,
sorry.
well,
Just
no,
kind of.
that's okay, because But the point is, you're hitting the nail on the head in terms of what the public is feeling. They're frustrated, they're angry, they're confused, they're afraid. They're looking for greener pastures. They want change, and for all the reasons you just said. And so the challenge, and this is what I built as the Conservative Party, was to build a very big tent, so that you had people right across the spectrum that all had those same issues. They expressed it maybe differently, some more vocally than others, but I tried to have focus on what those issues were and making a big tent. And I think it's a mistake of any political party, whether it's on the left or the right, to become very narrowly focused and miss the bigger picture of the struggles that people are having. When you've got a young mom that was working, full time, maybe you got their own, doing it through, the online economy. Your mom's expecting a second child, and she can't get a larger place in British Columbia. She's paying $3,000 a month for rent, and she looks at Alberta and she can get a 4-bedroom house for $1,800. What's she gonna do? She's gonna look at it and think, I love British Columbia, I want to be here, but I can't afford it, so I'm leaving. And so we have to change the things in British Columbia, and you can't just bring down prices of housing to comparable levels. You would crash the economy. You would have a depression in this province. So how do you solve the problem? You can't just say, well, people just have to live with it. So government needs to step up to the plate. And government is 35 to 45% of the cost of a new home. So government can moderate some of those costs. And that's through taxations, that's through various fees, that's through policies and approaches. You can moderate that so you can stabilize housing prices. And then what you need to do is you actually need to drive the economy and drive up wage growth. And by doing that, as wages go up and you stabilize prices and get government cost structure in line, now you've got a situation where British Columbia can be affordable again. But that's the only answer. There is no other magic bullet to be able to solve it. And government can't step up to the plate and say, oh, we're going to subsidize, we're going to buy condos, we're going to make housing. Like, that's just all bullshit. That's just spin by a government as opposed to addressing the real problems.
Do you think there needs to be a conversation about, I think, like, if we look back in towards the Olympics, I think the medium house in Vancouver at the Olympics back in 2011 was about 300,000. Now when we look at it, it's about 1.3 million. The taxes here in British Columbia, I think that, would it be worth having a conversation about, like, obviously property taxes increased with the prices of the property. And what my question now is well, if people, obviously the municipal side went up and, well, we're going to spend all this extra revenue, even though, people can't afford it. Is it worth having a conversation that we need to lower, taxes on the municipal level, on the income tax level? Like, is it worth that conversation at that point? Like, or are our books so hurting right now that our public service is too bloated? Do we need to have higher taxes indefinitely? Like, I just love to hear, like, what the solution is.
Oh, well, got a little bit of, unicorn spit here to sprinkle
Yeah.
around to make it all better. Like
No,
it's,
I get it. I
it's
just,
not,
as
and
someone,
I'll tell you,
yeah.
here's the challenge. Municipal governments in particular, but all governments of all levels shouldn't just pick on municipal governments. Municipal governments are unsustainable. Their cost structure is going up at a much faster rate than people's ability to pay. And they need to get in line. Do they really need, like the city of Vancouver, does it really need like 60 communications officers?
No.
What are they doing? does a housing project really not need to touch 70 desks, 70 desks in Vancouver to get approved? Like it doesn't need to do that. It doesn't need it in other countries. Why would we need it here? So there is things that can be done to help moderate those tax increases and bring some cost structure in line at the municipal level. But let's not forget, provincial and federal levels are just the same. The bureaucracy, think about this in British Columbia. We have seen a more than 50% increase. I think it's close to the 60% increase now in the size of the public service over the last decade. Can you say that services have improved? No.
No.
So why do we need all these additional people? What are they doing? What is the bureaucratic process? And this goes back to something we talked about right at the beginning, which is process is more important than results. Everybody builds these processes. And when you build process, you need people. You need staff, you need administration, you need monitoring of process, you need reviews of process. All these are involved people. You need to actually get back to the root of just providing services and people being responsible and accountable for delivering results, as opposed to building process and building up little empires. So government needs a complete overhaul in terms of how they do things and what they do and where we can find those efficiencies and reduce government's cost structure.
So I want to finish on two more questions here, John. So obviously, do you think that let's talk on the fall sitting. Do you think we're going to sit, or do you think that they're going to prorogue? What are your thoughts?
They're sitting.
They're sitting? Okay. And does David...
There are things they want to move forward. They want to address these treaties. They want to address DRIPA. They might even do a few surprising things that I've heard that I think will catch some people off guard. And so I suspect strongly that we are sitting this fall. They're looking forward to going back in the legislature this fall.
Oh, perfect. The NDP, do they keep David Eby? Is he going to sit in next election? Are we gonna go into the next election with David Eby, or do you think that they're gonna replace? His polling numbers don't look good there, John. Do you think that they're gonna replace him?
Well, there's a big if associated with that. If the Conservatives are in the lead, they'll replace him. If the NDP are in the lead, he may go early before they replace him. Right now, the NDP, most people don't realize if you're a member of the NDP, you're a member both federally and provincially. And so there's a large surge of memberships associated with the federal NDP leadership race. Those members will expire in April. So they don't want a leadership race until that happens. And then the leaders then will have the ability to bring in, sign up the members that they want in terms of a potential leadership race for the NDP in British Columbia. So I doubt they would get rid of him before April. And so the real question mark in my mind is, if the NDP have a lead going into the spring, will David Eby make the same mistake he made in 2024, or will he decide to go for an early election? I was convinced in 2020, going into 2024, that they would have an election in March and have the BC Liberals and the Conservatives divided. Eby decided not to do that, and he almost lost the election. We almost won as the Conservative Party. Will he do the same thing if he's got a potential lead and the Conservative Party is struggling? I wouldn't be surprised if he drops the writ early and tries to hold on to his leadership of the NDP. So, and lots of ups, lots of ifs. It's going to be an interesting, 6 months to a year here in politics. As it always is for those that enjoy watching what goes on in politics. Most of the rest of the people don't talk politics.
It's like sports.
The ball game's on.
No, I like to watch politics. But anyways, John, I appreciate you spending the last hour with me. I look forward to watching you guys in the fall, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Cheers, Jan.
If you're still here, good. It means you're paying attention. It means you're not asleep. You're not gaslit. You haven't been bought by the media spin or the liberal fairy tale that everything is fine while the country burns. I'm Dan Knight, and this is The Opposition. They have the consultants, they have the lobbyists, they have the legacy press, CBC, CTV, Global, spoon-feeding you government-approved talking points like it's North Korea, but with a better wardrobe. But we have each other. We've got the truth, we've got the grit, and we have the absolute audacity to stand up and say, no more. No more fake budgets, no more climate virtue signaling while our economy crumbles. No more surrendering your sovereignty to Brussels, Beijing, or Beltway elites. You can find me on Substack or Twitter, Dan Knight MMA, or on Instagram, and wherever honest Canadians are still allowed to speak freely. If you like what you heard, like it, share it, send it to someone who still thinks for themselves. We are building something here, not just commentary, but a coalition, a resistance to the rot, a community that refuses to bow, bend, or beg for permission. They have the legacy media, but we have you. And if we stick together, they don't stand a chance. Let's make it count. I'll see you on the next episode of The Opposition.